Welcome to the Sherman Report. Here's Peter Sherman.
Hello, everyone, on a Friday. A few stories out there I want to comment on a little later. The non-railway strike. The non-railway strike is one of them. The imminent Air Canada pilot strike is another. That's a real one. The feed and cement leader of the Ontario branch of CUPE, Fred Hahn, who remains intransigent on refusing to resign. And the Democratic National Convention ended with a newly minted presidential ticket of Kamala Harris and her VP choice, Tim Walz. Saw that last night. All of those will come in the last portion of the show. And with reference to my recent discussion that was yesterday with Lee Abrams, a radio consultant, about radio in general, and its lack of future direction, we'll be joined in a moment by a real live morning personality from Montreal. Well, he owned the airwaves for years, one of the last good guys, Dean Hagopian. Stay tuned. I am Peter Sherman.
You're with the Sherman Report. Daily news commentary available at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, with video posted on YouTube and Facebook. Here's Peter Sherman.
All right, if you're listening in Montreal today, or if you come from Montreal and are somewhere in Southern Ontario or anywhere else, because we're on the internet and you can see and hear us anywhere at 5 o'clock Eastern Time on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and X. Anyway, if you come from Montreal or you remember Top 40 radio playing the hits. Every city had stations that did. In Toronto, it was 1050 Chum. In Vancouver, it was C-Fun. In Montreal, it was, at one time or another, CKGM, CFCF, and CFOX, owned by the late Gordon Sinclair Jr. As a 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old, I listened to the hits. And ultimately, I was attracted to radio, which was more or less the way it was, but it's come and it's gone. And I'm sure you have great memories. CFOX particularly, and I don't want to confuse that. There is a CFOX that uses those call letters now in Vancouver. I'm talking about the one from the 60s, 70s that lived in West Island of Montreal. So Montreal's West Island had some remarkable people on it, none better than Dean Hagopian, who is by trade actually an actor. He imported those skills, smooth talking ability, comedic spirit to radio. He played the hits in Montreal. We heard Dean on CFOX. A little later on, some years later, on CJFM or FM 96, as it was known then. Actually, I was the manager there, so I made a smart decision. Dean was a singer, too, and has credits in film acting, but we'll be talking about that. He lives in Eastern Ontario now, and the two of us talk every once in a while. I think today counts as one of those times. So, with no further ado, welcome to the Sherman Report, Dean Hagopian.
Hey, that was owned by Gord Sinclair, Keith Dancy, and Danny Dooner from yeah.
Anyway, those guys were radio guys of the day, and they were shooters.
Oh, yeah, they certainly were, man. Radio when it was radio, you know.
Well, I could ask you about that, but I'll ask you about that now, and we'll get into you in a minute. What's radio now to you?
Well, it's not radio; it's a jukebox. You know, most of the stations you turn into, they don't even tell you what you're listening to. You have to look at your media on if you're driving your car to find out what you're listening to. All they do is spit out the call letters, and every so often they'll say something, but it's not radio, man.
Some radio. Well, I mean, the ratings of radio these days, and I talked about that with consultant Lee Abrams, who you'd have heard of back in the
sure.
And I said, "What's happened?" And he said, "Well, it's fallen on hard times. They can't pay the bank, and stations go bankrupt." You remember CHML Hamilton, 50,000 water, the news talk leader in that market, went off the air last week. Done.
I know. Then and back in the late 50s, when I went from my hometown of Galt to Woodstock to London, and I used to listen to Paul Reed on CHML, and he invited me down, put me on the show, which he did also on CJD a number of times. One of the truly great pipes in the business, I'll tell you.
Paul Reed, a great memory for me as well. So look, let me go back a little bit in the life of Dean Hagopian, which is starting to be a pretty long life. What attracted you to radio in the first place, and particularly the radio that entertained teens and adolescents, plus a few adults back then?
Oh yeah, well, like I said, I started in golf. I always wanted to be in film, in movies, and finally I got around to it. We can get to that a little bit later. But back in those days, I'm in golf. The only other radio course was at Ryerson in Toronto, but it was also that area of apprenticeship. So I figured it was better to work for cheap and learn than move away from home and pay to learn. And so I got on hands experience, golf, Woodstock, London, Ontario, Ottawa.
All those little medium markets, and then working your way up to something approaching a major market, and finally into a major market. And that's an interesting story for not only your life, but that's the life of the itinerant radio jock
Yeah.
way back in the day. That's how you learned it.
Yeah. And well, they still do. Some of them ones, well, of course, I don't know, they're grinding out people for radio these days. But again, it doesn't matter. You're going to have to start at the smaller stations and work your way up. Simple as that.
You know what, Dean? I'm one of the few people who, if I asked his story, and I won't belabor this because you know it, I never went and worked the small market. I was working in other areas like news, and before that in technical. But I started at CJAD 50,000.
Wow.
Oh, who does that? It was me, and it wasn't because I was special. I just did it, and I had a good time with it.
Well, you were always qualified for it. You're always good at what you did. I know that for sure.
Well, so were you, and now we're a couple of old guys talking about an old thing that indeed is radio, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. One of the reasons I got onto the radio subject this week was because 2 days ago was National Radio Day. I'm not sure what that means anymore, but some people celebrated it. And a lot of unemployed radio people, I guess, did too.
Oh yeah, no, I saw the Radio Day, and I thought, that happened a long time ago. This isn't radio anymore. I hear some of these stations will have 2 or 3 people on in the morning, and they're entertaining each other. They're not talking to you. I was always talking to that one person or that 10,000 person that listened to the show. My show was directed at them. And now they just entertain each other, man.
Well,
and
they call those morning zoos oftentimes, where you've got a gal and 2 guys, or 2 girls and a guy. Doesn't really matter, but it's Joe, John, and Jane. And you're right, they talk to each other. But when we were in this craft together, you're right, because you sat in a studio by yourself. You had an operator on the other side of the glass, oftentimes to try to personify an audience. You'd look to your operator for feedback on what you were doing. But you made a great thing out of your acting ability by playing characters.
Yeah, I did. I did about 12 or 13 characters on that. I kind of have to kind of thank Bill Brady at who used to be at CKSL, and then he went to Chum in Toronto against Belisca, and then he came back and went to CFPL for the longest time. He was he was my mentor. And then I used to listen to Gene Noble, WLEC at Nashville, Tennessee. And Belisca was pretty good too. And then there was the guy WKBW in Buffalo. Oh God, what was his name? He did the nighttime show. I can't think of Joey Reynolds. Yeah. He was great. So those were the guys that I used to listen to, and then I really have to give a lot of the credit to Jonathan Winters. I mean, I fell in love with. I'll tell you, I was working at CFPL doing the all-night show, and you're at the end of a long hallway all by yourself, and you have to run to the newsroom, rip and read, and so I got this. I did that. Yeah. On the teletype, right?
Yep.
And so I'm reading these stories, and they always had a kicker at the end. And the kicker was they found this guy hanging from the mast of a ship nude in San Francisco Bay, claiming he was John Q from outer space. And I thought, oh my God, I got to check this out. And it was Jonathan Winters. And I drove to Detroit and got his first album. And they put him in the Funny Farm for about 6 months. He
Yeah.
came in and did that first album, and I did it. And I could do every voice on that album. I worked on that, and Sammy Davis Jr. With that old black magic. He did all kinds of impersonations. I was able to do all of that. And then I brought whatever I could do into radio and created a bunch of other characters, and some of them were copies of Jonathan Winters, and I did the Stone Ranger in Toronto. But speaking of great radio where people were entertained, the last I heard of anybody being that great in Toronto was Pete Griffin and
Pete and
Pete,
Gates.
Pete and Geets
Yeah.
at Chum, and then at CFNY. And there are a number of times that Geets went away on holidays. I got a chance to sit in with Pete, one of the greatest times of my life.
Well, you do have a legendary radio career. I'm remembering, it just popped into my head, standing off stage in the Chateau Champlain ballroom. And if I'm not mistaken, we had about 3,500 people in that place, and the fire marshal's office was concerned because it was overoccupied, and it was an FM 96 60s sock hop. You and
Yeah.
I were standing together. Do you remember what we were doing?
Uh,
I'll give
no.
you a hint.
There we go. There we go.
So we were having a good time at that show as well.
Yeah, man. I had a great time at all the shows. Thanks to Donald K. Donald, a legend in Montreal in his own right. I emceed most of the shows at the Forum from about 65 to 70. Hendrix, James Brown, who became a friend of mine, thank goodness, and Led Zeppelin, The Who, and all. But Hendrix was the most intense. I got to spend about 20 minutes with him backstage before he went on. And I did that with the Stones too. I emceed the Stones and all those guys. I never saw anybody so intent on performing and knocking the ball out of the park than Hendrix, man.
I got to tell you something. I was at that show.
Oh wow, wasn't that a pisser?
We have a lot of interesting ties. Let me ask you about something else. A few weeks ago, a friend of ours, aged 89, Dave Boxer, who was a chief competitor of yours across the street at CFCF, passed away, and I think we were both pretty sad about that.
Yeah. Dave and I were really heavy competitors while he was on the air and then off the air. And then when he worked at sales at CJD, we became friends. And I had a lot of respect for David.
If you had a do-over for all of that part of your life, which is the major part of your life, would you change anything?
Yeah, I'd never do another morning show.
Why wouldn't you? I think I know the answer, but I have to ask it. Why wouldn't you do another morning show?
It's not my best time to work. It's not my best time to be creative, and Sinclair talked me into it when he decided to pack in the morning show, and I considered a privilege and an honor and a little more money, of course, and so I jumped at it, and then I ended up doing mornings for ages too long.
You were amazing at it. You may not have liked getting up, but you woke me up. That's what we did. Anyway,
I had a good time.
It sounds to me like in your own way, although there are some things that are ups and some things that are downs, that if you put the whole thing into a mixing bowl and I said to you, look at that, that's the sum total of your days. Do you miss those days?
I miss that. Yeah. There's times that I wish I was still on the air doing something, but my kind of radio is not the kind of radio they want anymore, and they don't want old guys my age. Doing radio, and there are times when I feel creative and I feel funny and I feel like I put together some funny stuff, and like to get out and do it. But I always focused on music too. It wasn't just the entertaining. I mean, I played. I was the first. I played all of Motown, man. I started playing Motown back in '59, along with Rosalie Tremblay from
CKL.
CKLW Windsor. She was the best, man. She when I worked for Johnny Nash, I was his A&R promotion guy for about a year and a half. I broke all his records, Hold Me Tight and Cupid and all that stuff. And then I worked for John. Of all the people, all the program directors, all the music directors I ever contacted on behalf of Johnny Nash and Byron Lee and Bob Marley, who I spent a couple of weeks of my life with in Jamaica, Rosalie Tremblay was the best ears, the best talent, hands down. Chum was the worst. Chum Radio.
Well, that's interesting observation, trivia, coming from a guy who lived that entire era. And I have to say, it's the golden days of radio, because that's never coming back.
No, I don't think so.
Well, I don't think either of us is coming back on radio either, but it looks like we're both living good lives. And one of the reasons that we don't go back to radio, amongst many, being too old is one of them, is we can do this. We can get on the internet, we can have live television, and we can broadcast it again on podcasts on audio the next day or the day after that, whenever people are available to listen, so they don't have to tune their radio with an alarm clock. I'm going to say this, Dean. I really loved working with you. I had a great time, but even more than working with you, I loved listening to you when I was a younger guy and you were doing what you did.
Yeah, that means a lot, man. I appreciate that very much.
Well, best of luck in whatever happens, wherever life takes you. It's always a pleasure talking to you. And
right now, I'm working on a script. I got an audition on Monday.
There you go. So there's a guy who never stops. Stops. And Dean, don't ever stop until the good Lord stops you. I'm the same way.
You too, brother. You too. And it's just wonderful to see you again. It really is.
We'll keep talking.
If I get down to Timor, we'll have a Creemore together.
I'll look forward to that. And we will keep talking by phone. Take care of yourself.
You too, brother. Take care.
All
God
right.
love.
Dean Hagopian, and we'll be back in a moment.
You're with the Sherman Report, daily news commentary available at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, with video posted on YouTube and Facebook. Here's Peter Sherman.
Well, that was fun. Even as we age, we look back on great times, and that is a living legend from a time long ago in my life, and all of you have that in your lives. If you are somewhere up north of 50, you remember radio as it once was, and I certainly spent a life in it, as has Dean, and we remember it too, and we remember it fondly. All right, I want to get into, not that radio isn't a serious subject, I want to get into some serious subjects of the day. The first thing I think I want to mention is Air Canada. Even the inept Trudeau government knew that Canada doesn't work without the railroads, which both had shut down. This was yesterday, in the face of a lockout beginning yesterday, complete with picketers and their signs already out there on display at railway yards, but it didn't last very long. I'm talking a period of hours. Labor Minister Steve McKinnon said it was clear that a bargain settlement between the Canadian National Railway, Canadian Pacific, and the two railways' unionized workers remained, his word, elusive. In response, McKinnon said he would direct the Canadian Industrial Relations Board to impose binding arbitration to extend the workers' collective agreements in the meantime. And that's that. But as this was occurring, along came Air Canada pilots who announced that they'll strike next month. The Airline Pilots Association represents about 5,400 Air Canada pilots, and they got a 98% mandate to strike in a vote that had been held earlier. The pilots are complaining that they earn half of what their industry counterparts do. I imagine they're talking about the States, because who are their industry counterparts in Canada? Anyway, they have run out on a 10-year agreement, giving them 2% every year. That would be 20% compounded, which doesn't sound so bad. But then again, I'm not working for money anymore. So I'll leave it to them. But what does this do to the traveling public right now in what's loosely known as the post-COVID era? Travel is up, with passenger traffic increasing almost 25% from 2022 to 2023. That alone. Air Canada is warning the public. If you find yourself facing a canceled or delayed flight due to the ongoing labor dispute, it's important to know your options and steps to minimize disruption to your travel plans. According to their website, if you arrive at your destination due to cancellation causing 3 or more hours after your scheduled time of arrival, you may be entitled to compensation up to $1,000. Put that in your little notebook up here. What do you think? What do I think? Send the labor minister out again and announce binding arbitration as you did with the railways. Pilots are important, no doubt about it, but air travel in general is important too, and certainly in a country as big as Canada. Sure, there are other carriers, and if you add them all up, they don't begin to pick up the slack that Air Canada's on strike would cause. Minister McKinnon, it is in your hands. So please, sir, get busy. All right. I also have a few thoughts about Fred Hahn. Talked about him yesterday. Everybody's talking about him today. I've met Fred Hahn. I know Fred Hahn. Stop talking. This is just when I thought I was done with that topic. There's something called honor in this world. Honor. Honor is the ability to hold your head high and comply when those around you stated publicly that they think your best before date has come and gone, and that you should go away too. I'm talking about Fred Hahn of CUPE. That applies to you, Fred. I spoke a little about Fred yesterday. He's demonstrated that he has no sense of honor. His union asked him to resign from his post as president of CUPE Ontario. I said, I know Fred. I know he loves the job. Problem is, he's shown disrespect repeatedly to his Jewish members and to his members at large. He claims he has no problem with Jews, just with Israel in its actions with Gaza. Fred, you haven't figured out, or at least you fail to understand, that Israel is the one that was attacked on October 7th, and brutally so. The attack materialized out of nowhere by Hamas out of Gaza, and it was financed by those in Iran who have no interest in any kind of peace and who are not interested in being fully cooperative across the Middle East, Persian Gulf area. Jews generally are in support of Israel, and they recognize that the world ties to Zionism. The world is tied to Zionism via Judaism. Yes, there are a few cases where some Jews prefer to stand back and say that Israel should go it on its own, but the vast majority would say, as I do, I'm Jewish, I'm Zionist, I support Israel. You're not understanding that. You're not understanding that they started the war. You're not understanding that Jews and Zionists are, these days, pretty well one and the same. You turned Judaism and Zionism into killer labels when you reposted a cartoon on Facebook, Fred, a cartoon which took an Olympic diver wearing a Star of David going off the high board, but instead of landing in the pool, landed as a bomb, which exploded into a scene depicting Gaza destruction. We know what you intended. Your national leadership knows what you intended, but most of all, Fred, you know what you intended. Fred Hahn won't resign. Hahn says he will not resign because he believes the decision must be made by members who democratically reelected him earlier this year. So I guess he has decided that it's not his seniors at the board level of CUPE Canada who write the rules, it's him. His response came after Ontario Premier Doug Ford called Hahn a disgusting human being, and I'm quoting, while praising one of his own ministers for recently criticizing Hahn to his face over the Israel-Hamas war, and asked union members to vote him out. CUPE has said it will not take advice from Ford, who they claim is a union-hating premier, but they demanded Hahn's resignation anyway because he reposted a deeply problematic video. I described it. It violates, they say, its equality policy, CUPE's equality policy. This is a message to CUPE members. There are mechanisms to remove a recalcitrant leader like Fred Hahn, who has embarrassed all of you. Throw him out. Throw Fred Hahn out and do it now. That's enough from me on Fred Hahn. All right. Before I leave you for the weekend, a thought or two on the Democratic Party, the Democratic National Convention, which finished yesterday. I watched a lot of it. I'll say this, they're damn good at showmanship. And they touched all the bases. Speeches in particular were exceptionally well crafted. The Obamas, while not my cup of tea, are tremendous presenters. Tim Walz, whether he's a socialist baseball coach and a great family man or not, got the crowd roaring. And Kamala Harris, why didn't you ever speak like that as vice president or when you contested the presidency 4 years ago and did poorly? Her speech was a remarkable assembly of material aimed at every group or person she wanted to address. Did that convert me and make me a Harris supporter? Absolutely not. I believe that the Harris candidacy, the Biden resignation, and everything about the last 4 to 6 weeks in American politics was contrived. I am not in a position to point any fingers because I don't know the inner workings of the Democratic Party, nor for that matter, the Republican Party. I do not accept that a slogan like do something or forward amounts to anything unless you really believe, all Americans believe, that it's possible. But I don't see it materializing under this contrived situation that has resulted in a Harris-Walz ticket. I do not view Donald Trump as a force of darkness, which is what they called him. Is he strange and ego-driven? Everybody knows he is. I think he knows he is. Does he put himself first? Yes, he does. It's what megalomaniacs do. So do I like him? No, not much. Then why would I think he'd be better at being president than Kamala Harris? Because he has shown us that he can lead. I think he can stop the various existing wars in the world more easily than anyone else, and the incipient ones, with his drama and force of will. Other leaders are intimidated. I'm talking about world leaders. They're intimidated by him. And in 2024, that would be a plus. Kamala would set about turning the USA into her perception of a more equalized place. There's something to be said for that. A place where everybody truly gets a chance. I think she believed it when she said it, but it's a hell of a way to start showing it when no contender but Kamala herself had any chance to seek the presidency. All of this tightly choreographed situation looked precisely as it was, managed. At this point, knowing as I do that American elections are virtually always decided by a swing vote in the so-called Rust Belt, we can expect a winner by maybe 1% to 2%, in my view. Who will it be? I wouldn't even try to call it. And besides, we have a serious debate to observe in about 2 weeks that may distinguish the candidates well enough to do so. Remember that 10 weeks is an eternity in politics, and that's how long we have to go. Now, here's the big question some of you ask out loud, and I'm going to ask it and answer it. Why does it matter to us Canadians? Well, because we sit immediately adjacent to America along 3,500 kilometers of border, and we trade as much as $1 billion daily. We are the biggest customer that America has, but more importantly, that we are the biggest customer that they have. We have no say in their politics, but we will have to react to them. More to come, and of that I am certain. Okay, thanks for joining us. Remember, the show is live between 5 and 5:30 weekdays on YouTube, Facebook, X, and LinkedIn. You can always find a video of it on any of those social media under my name, Peter Sherman. If you click share on Facebook or repost on X, you'll be sending it to your own friends and expanding our success. And we're doing pretty well. If you don't need or care to watch the video, we post the audio as a podcast on all the platforms, and they include Apple and Spotify, all of the names you know, anyone that you bother to download your podcast from. Then you can just listen in your car or on your device at your own convenience. Enjoy the weekend. I'm Peter Sherman.
The Sherman Report, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the video version at YouTube, Facebook, and always at petersherman.com. Thanks for listening to the Sherman Report. If you'd like to connect with Peter directly, just go to petersherman.com.